Welcome to Haggie Reads for You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, Haggie, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi, everybody. It's Colleen, and it is Tuesday, January 26th, 2016, and this is Haggie Reads for You. And today I'm going to pick up where I left off last week with Alien Minds by E. Everett Evans. "Give me that again, Kurt," he demanded, and under his questioning brought out the fact that his father, Admiral Newton, was also a prisoner of these unknowns, as was the fourth member of the SS who had been assigned to Estrella, Morris Manning. Manning couldn't stand the pain. He died. Hooper's thought was strangely calm and apparently heartless, which Hanlon knew could not be the man's true feelings, for Hooper and Manning had been close friends of long standing. What kind of pain? Who was hurting him? Hanlon demanded, sick with dread. Were all of you being tortured? Was Dad? Oh, God! Why couldn't he get in there and read the true answers? As best as he could figure it out, they had never seen their captors, but had felt his mind probing theirs, asking questions, interrogating them in the Australian language. Whoever was doing it apparently did not intend it to be torture, for when Manning died, the other two received a curiously surprised yet apologetic thought. "Your nerve sensitivity is greater than ours. It was not intended to force this entity's life force out of physical embodiment. Great care shall be used in the future." "Tell me more about Dad," Hanlon commanded, agonizedly. "Where is he held? Who has him? What's it all about?" But the dazed Hooper relapsed back to the only words he seemed able to say out loud. "Gotta run! Gotta get away! But you're safe here, Kurt. No one's following you, and I won't let anyone or anything hurt you. Relax. Gotta run! Gotta get away!" And so powerful was the urge that the supine body twitched restlessly, and it began breaking out of the paralysis Hanlon had imposed on it. Frantically, Hanlon continued his mind scanning, asking innumerable questions that he hoped would penetrate the other's consciousness and force his mind to think along the lines Hanlon wanted to know. And slowly, sketchily, he began to piece together a picture of sorts, like a jigsaw puzzle, of which many of the pieces were missing. The 3 SS men had been brought together in some little stone building. There the unknown, whom they never saw nor heard, had interrogated them mentally, a process that was extremely painful in a way that Hooper could not or did not specify, save that his mind seemed to wince and recoil from any thought of the method, despite Hanlon's utmost attempts to learn it. There seemed to have been days and nights of this painful questioning, although Hooper could not tell exactly how long, and Hanlon knew it could not have been very many days since he had seen Manning so recently. Then, early this morning, shortly after Manning's death and while Hooper was being questioned, it seemed to him the mental voice had gone away abruptly, leaving him in full command of his senses. He had immediately begun to examine the room, and soon found that the low door was unfastened. Cautiously he opened it, and discovered that it had opened to the outside of the building, The Admiral had not been in the room with him at the time, nor could Cooper find a way into the other parts of the building, if there were any other parts to it. Therefore, he had lost no time in leaving by the providentially open door. He started running across the lawn toward the nearest road. Down this he ran, knowing only a terrified compulsion to run, to hide, to get away from that horrible Inquisition. "How long have you been running?" Hanlon asked sympathetically, yet in hopes it might give him a clue. "Gotta run, gotta get away," Hooper's word said, but the thought flashed across his mind, since after dawn. Then Dad's not too far away, Hanlon thought, and began trying to guess where or in what direction the prison might be, and how he could locate it most quickly. He was awakened to reality to see Hooper rise from the bed, the paralysis broken by that inner compulsion to flee. Before Hanlon could jump up to stop him, Hooper was out of the room. Hanlon let him go. He hated to do it, but there was no apparent way he could save Hooper now, and he had to get his father just as fast as he could. Not only because the Admiral was his adored dad, but because he was second in command of the whole ISC's Secret Service, and in charge of the mission, and thus the most important at the moment. But where is he? Hanlon's thoughts were an agonized wail. For the first time in months he felt very young and inexperienced and unsure. He jumped to his feet to leave the house and start searching, but restrained himself before he got to the door. "Whoa, boy, not so fast. I haven't got the faintest idea where Dad is. Must think this out first and not waste a lot of time during which he might die or be killed." He sank back into his chair again, and his mind swiftly reviewed the pitifully small bits of information he'd been able to glean from the deranged mind of his friend Hooper. Someone, or something, or some group, who were the main support of this opposition, had a mental ability Hanlon thought he knew the Australians did not have. At least he had not found any traces of it anywhere here. Or, wait now, did the rulers have it? Was this one of the traits and abilities especially bred into them in the course of making them capable of handling their tremendous task of being planetary ruler? Could be. He had not yet had the chance to scan mentally Ellis Amour, the present ruler, except for that one night at the theater. And then he had not really tried to see what the man had in the way of mental equipment. Hanlon had been so relieved to find that he and the audience were applauding, instead of booing, that he had tried not to do so. If Elis Amir as ruler had it, did Adwan Irad as second in line also have those mental powers? Whoever or whatever it was, and that would have to be studied more thoroughly later, some mind or minds had forced the other three Secret Servicemen to go to a certain place, at present unknown to Hanlon, and had there imprisoned them and tried to extract information from their minds. Information about what? And why? What could these unknowns want to know that couldn't be learned by asking direct questions? For the Federation statesmen and surveymen had been glad and anxious to answer fully and truthfully every question that had been asked of them. And that puzzling thought Hooper had said they received when Manning died. Your nerve density is greater than ours. We had not realized it would kill you to be thus interrogated. Or words to that effect. As far as Hanlon knew, the native Australians did not have unusual resistance to pain. He had on several encounters with them so far, and had known cases where they were hurt or wounded, and had not noticed any great immunity to pain. Was this, then, another special attribute of the rulers? But Egon, or Irad, had certainly felt pain when Ebony scratched his chin, and had made quite a fuss about it. Was it real, or was he putting on an act to conceal his immunity? Somehow, Hannon was not willing to accept that last. Dimly in the back of his mind, there seemed to be another puzzling thought. What was it? Hanlon worried at it like one of the Roches might worry a bone, and finally it struck him hard. If the other three had been captured, why hadn't he? At its multi-phase scanner in the spaceship high above, the being stiffened suddenly. For long minutes the mind concentrated on this new problem. The plan put into operation that morning had been partially successful. The location of that unreadable mind, before noticed, found once and then lost, was now known again. But still, despite every effort, contact with that mind could not be made. After a time, therefore, with the utmost precision, a thought was insinuated into the Australian mind, constantly being held captive. The thought was seen to take hold, then its strength and urgency was increased. Soon, although the native was at a loss to account for the reason why such a thought could come to him at that present time, he nevertheless sent a note to a certain person, giving forceful orders that were to be obeyed immediately. Chapter 11. At that thought, fear struck at George Hanlon's vitals, almost like a physical blow. What was planned for him? For certainly, if these unknowns were on to what the Terrans or the Corps and the Secret Service were trying to do here, and had already captured and tortured 3 of the 4, they would not leave him free to continue working against them. Cold sweat started from all his pores. Hanlon sank into the chair, nails digging into the palms. His bravado, his cockiness, his belief in his own superiority, all ebbed away like a swift falling tide. He had been used to working alone in the service. He had been mostly by himself on Simonides, and altogether alone on Algon. Yet he had not felt such an aloneness, such an absolute withdrawal of all support, as he knew in this awful moment. For at the other places he could contact the SS through the safety deposit boxes, or by the Andromeda 7 password, and get almost instant response, and the entire resources of the course to back him up. And here on Australia, while he'd been working alone, he met the others occasionally, and the men with the Corps sneak boat every fortnight. He had known they were there, but now they were gone, and Hanlon was to be the next victim, and he had no idea who, what, when, where, or why. For long minutes he sat, shaking with dread, his mind a chaos of nothingness but a swirling, roiling, panic fear. This was far, far different from that terrible fear he had known back on the Helene, when he first had realized he was tangling with trained, unprincipled, and viciously conscienceless killers, or the time he'd been changed in the Prime Minister's dungeon on Simonides. For there he'd been facing known problems. This one was totally unknown, and man has always felt far more fear of the terrors he cannot see than those he can face. Blast back, he thought, determinedly, ashamed of his fear and resolved to conquer it. I've got through those other troubles all right in the end. How do I know I won't with this? At least I can be a man and not a crybaby, especially before I'm actually in danger. It was sorry advice and he knew it, but it was just enough at that moment to help him pull himself together. So maybe they can kill me, after torturing me. So what? I don't expect to live forever, and I knew when I got into this service that it was dangerous. After all, I could get killed any minute just performing routine Corps duties, or if I'd remained a civilian at my daily job or walking the streets of Terra. By main force of will and character, Hanlon forced the fear back and away from the surface of his mind. He concentrated on the problem at hand, how to find where his father was held captive. Hooper had apparently been running for about 2 hours when Hanlon first discovered him, his mind had told. All right. Where's that map of Stiara and vicinity he had brought? Ah, there on the table. Let's see now. A man in Hooper's condition could run maybe 10 or 12 miles in that time, since his mental terror would have overcome physical fatigue until his muscles could absolutely obey no longer. All right. Circle this point with a ring with a 12-mile radius. So. But Kurt was coming from the south. Concentrate on that direction for the moment. What lies 10 to 12 miles from here in the south? He examined the map carefully, trying to visualize in his mind what lay out in that direction. The ruler's palace was more or less south, but nearer to 15 miles. Could Hooper have run that fast since dawn? Hanlon didn't think so, though the man had so evidently been running until almost exhausted. The section Hanlon was visualizing was, he remembered now, mostly filled with larger homes and estates of the more influential and wealthy. Yander's house? No, that was more to the west, and only about 2 miles from here. Of course, Hooper could have been circling and zigzagging during those hours. Oh, but not that much, surely. Carefully, Hanlon pored over the map, trying to figure where his father could possibly be held. Suddenly, a bit to the east and about 11 miles from the street where Hanlon lived, he noticed a penciled dot he had previously made on the map. Everett's house! Of course, Hanlon gasped. And that enigmatic stone building, Hooper had thought stone, behind the house. Also, all indications up to the present pointed toward the second in line as the head man of the criminal element, and that probably meant of the opposition as well. But Hooper's thoughts had been that the SS men's torture and inquisition had been mental. Did Irad have that power? Hanlon had asked himself that before, but now it became increasingly evident that he did. He must have. Besides, now that Hanlon was concentrating on the subject, there had been that curious sensation of a mental block or barrier Hanlon thought he felt in Egon Irad's mind. What was behind that curtain? Well, Hanlon shivered. There's only one way to find out. I'll have to scout this place more closely and see if he's it. He rose determinedly to start out, but halted as he realized it was broad daylight, and that he could not go there and investigate the house and grounds, and that stone building in the back, without being seen. He would have to take this slow and easy. Too much depended on him, and there was very little chance of his making it undiscovered even under the best of circumstances. He must not take chances that he knew beforehand were doomed to failure, for he was now the sole and only possibility of his father being freed. That sneak boat was not due for another week and a half, and with Manning and Hooper out of the picture. Chafing at the delay, his mind a turmoil of tortured thoughts, conflict between his desire to rush and the logical knowledge that he must wait until dark. Hanlon passed the most miserable time of his young life. He had thought he had plumbed the depths of mental agony during those dreadful 7 minutes when he had stood at rigid attention in the office of Admiral Rogers, Commandant of Cadets. But that had been a mere child's game compared to all this fretful waiting. But those deep, inner, and innate characteristics which made George Hanlon what he was came to the fore during those hours, as he forced himself to endure the wait he knew he must accomplish. And in that period, George Hanlon reached closer to full maturity. He touched, examined, and accepted the tremendous concept that man's highest pinnacle of success, his greatest heights of achievement in personal integration, laid in working with others for the common good of all, not in feeling that any one man is indispensable. One man, himself of course, better than others, and more capable than they of achieving all goals. Sure, he had an ability none of the others had, but that did not make him any better than nor above them. They, in turn, had many capabilities he did not possess. They were actually as valuable as his mental abilities, if not more so. As an individual, any one of them could fail. As a team, each giving of his best, they could win out. And now someone or some group had broken up the team. Well, it was up to him to get it back together again. George Hanlon suddenly awoke. He sprang from his chair, astonished to see through the window of his room that it was dark outside. He grinned mirthlessly. He had actually fallen asleep there in his chair, in the midst of all his worries. Then suddenly he realized why. He had thought the matter through, reached definite conclusions, and had known inwardly that everything was now as it must be until a certain time. Thus calmed and facing that fact, however unconsciously, he had fallen asleep to gain strength for the coming ordeal. Now it was time to go. Therefore he had awakened. He took another half hour to prepare and eat a good meal. He would need all the strength he could get, then left his room and the house. Mounting his trike, he sped away at its swiftest pace toward the neighborhood where Adwal Irad's house lay. The alien, watching from above in its scanners, saw that entity with the unreadable mind leave its home and start away on its mechanical carrier. Tracing its course, the being was soon able to make a shrewd guess as to its destination. Instantly, the alien's mind went into action, and under its compulsion, 4 armed men hastened to Irad's house and hid themselves within its partially darkened interior, yet kept careful watch on the outside premises. Hanlon had long since decided just how to approach the place. Leaving his machine concealed in the deep shadows of a spreading flower tree, he slipped quietly through the edge of the grounds next door. Dodging from tree to bush, carefully watching all about to make sure he was not seen nor followed, he came to a large tree close to the Irad property, hurdled a low hedge, and dashed across the dividing line to come to stop beneath another tree well into the grounds of the second in line. From that one he made his cautious, soundless way, until he was only about 10 yards from the house itself. There were only a couple of lights showing through the windows, but his heart sank at the realization that someone was at home. "I should have had a bird watching to see if Irad left," he scolded himself. But he continued on, making a final dash across the remaining yardage until he was right beside the house itself, in a deep shadow. Carefully, he inched his way along toward the nearest window from which a light showed. Reaching it, he very slowly rose and peered through the lower corner of the pane. This was apparently a sort of living room or library, as he could see a number of easy chairs, carbide lamps on standards for reading, a couple of small tables with art objects or flowers on them. Along one wall were recesses holding reading scrolls, but there was no one in the room he could see. He crept on to another window and repeated his inspection. This one was a bedroom, but again no one was there. Maybe Irad just leaves a couple of lights on when he's away, Hanlon considered. He crept on to another window, but there was no light, and he could not see what was within. He rounded a corner of the five-sided house, going toward the back, but there were no lighted windows in that side. He ran along it to the back, noting as he did so that he passed a closed door. He now was close to that little stone building at the rear, which he had previously noted, and which he was sure his father was imprisoned. There was no light showing, and apparently no windows at all. He ran toward it swiftly, and ducked into its shadow. He circled it completely, but there was only one door, locked. George Hanlon probed with his mind toward the interior, and faintly, just barely, on the threshold of his consciousness, he caught a familiar thought pattern. "It's Dad," he exulted, but silently. Almost forgetting caution, he doubled back and was attacking that locked door when a sound behind him made him whirl about. A number of men were boiling swiftly out that door in the main house he had passed a few moments before, and the light now shining out reflected on the unmistakable flame guns in their hands. In that first quick glance, he had recognized Yandor as one of the men. Yike! Hanlon knew a deep disappointment, which did not stop him from starting away from there on a dead run. He increased his speed as he heard the pounding of heavy feet behind him. He dashed toward the nearest yard, trying always to keep in the shadows. Fortunately, he was fleeter than his pursuers, and gained considerable yardage on them. Around that next house he ran, and across the next yard. A couple of flame gun flashes sprung out at him, but not close. The gangsters were also flashing the lights from reflector lanterns, trying to locate and spotlight him for more accurate shooting. In the drive of that neighboring house, Hanlon saw one of the Australian motor trikes. It took him but a moment to activate that engine, for a wonder caught almost immediately. He jumped into the seat and was picking up speed as he reached the street and swung down it. Behind he heard an outcry as the owners saw the theft of their machine, also the angry yells of the men chasing him. These little trikes were made for local trips only, and were not powered for speed or distance. The best he was able to coax out of the acetylene-powered engine was about 20 miles an hour. He had not gone a mile before he heard behind him the sound of one of the larger trikes, whose greater-size motor he knew had a top speed of 30 miles an hour. Pushing his little machine as fast as it'd go, Hanlon looked wildly about him for some place for safety. He knew he only had a few minutes before the bigger trike would catch up with him, or at least be within shooting distance. But how had they known he was coming? They must have been lying in wait to have taken him so completely off guard. Else why or how could they have been hiding in semi-darkness to come rushing out of that door, their flamers ready to cinder him? A momentary blackness of fear struck at him, but he threw it off by an effort of will. They hadn't caught him yet, and by the great John Snyder, they wouldn't. Ha! Off there to the left was a little patch of woods, and just ahead was a corner. He made as though to keep straight on, then swerved at the last minute toward the left. His tires shrieked at the sudden braking and swift turn, and the little machine almost overturned, but he made it. Glancing back, he saw the larger, swifter tricycle hurtle past the corner he had so unexpectedly turned. They would give him a little extra leeway before they would stop, turn around, and come back down the road he was on. Soon he reached the beginning of the wood, and was in the shadows its trees cast across the road. Luckily, he thought, his little machine had no lights, and it would be that much harder for them to spot him in the darkness. He went a little farther, then slowed a bit, swung his right leg over to the left side of the trike and threw himself off, allowing it to continue on without him. How far it would go unguided he did not know, but hoped it would be some distance. Glancing backward over his shoulders as he ran, he saw the lights of the gangster's car pass. For some minutes he continued running, zigzagging a bit around the trees, hoping to get far enough away so that they couldn't find him. As he ran, he continued thinking about what had happened. Were those goons actually waiting for me? It didn't seem possible anyone could have suspected him personally, or have any idea he was going to be around at Irad's house tonight. How could they possibly? He hadn't told anyone. That unknown mind power again? Memory of that someone with that extraordinary mental powers who had captured and imprisoned and questioned the other SS men came to him, and again, involuntarily, he shuddered. It probably was not that one or ones. He tried to deny the belief. Undoubtedly, those gun-carrying men were merely guarding the house on general principles, either because Irad was second in line or else because... Gosh, almost forgot. I'm sure Dad's there. For those were his thoughts I was just beginning to catch, I know. His mind texture is unmistakable. I'll bet those guys were there as guards for that reason. I'll have to... He stopped short and dodged behind a tree, for his quick ear had caught a crackling in the underbrush behind him. He tried to peer out through the dimness, but could not see anyone, although he could see 2 or 3 lances of light that he knew were the reflectors of the gangsters. I didn't realize they'd get this close this quick, he almost wailed. I gotta get out of here, but fast. He started off as quietly as he could, but there were so many fallen leaves and dead twigs and branches underfoot that he could not help making some noise. Suddenly a lance of flame almost caught him. He dodged quickly again. There was another shot in his general direction that did not hit him, but it did touch a dry, dead branch. Instantly there was a flare of light as the wood caught fire, and in moments a considerable blaze was started that made further concealment impossible. Only flight was left. Hanlon turned and ran toward the farther edge of the wood. Behind him he could hear footsteps rapidly following, and a voice bellowing, "Here he is!" Chapter 12. George Hanlon ran as he had never run before, but somehow, surprisingly, that Australian native not only kept up with him, but the young SS man could tell from the sound that he was catching up. This guy must be half greyhound, Hanlon thought, although he himself was slowed down by those huge shoes, to which he was not yet too accustomed, so that when running he had trouble not stumbling over his own feet. It was hard remembering to keep his legs spread further apart than normal. He finally saw just ahead of him the far edge of the wood, and beyond that, a great open meadow. He would be in clear sight out there unless he could outdistance his pursuers, and this closest one was much too near for that. He would have to stop this gunny somehow, and now. Hanlon ducked behind a great tree and peered out carefully. In his hands he held a knob of wood he had picked up. Soon he saw the native come running between the trees, straight in his direction. Hanlon took a firmer grip on his club and raised it above his head. The mobster came alongside the tree. The club came down hard. 1 down. Hanlon started on across the meadow then, for the woods was afire, and he felt there was no chance of escape that way. He hoped he could find some sort of hiding place out there, quite sure in his mind he could not outdistance the men following. He zigzagged a bit as he ran and kept looking back over his shoulder from time to time. Hanlon had covered nearly 200 yards and was looking again back over his shoulder when suddenly his foot struck something and he pitched headlong. The breath whooshed out of him as he landed. He felt as though he was a mass of cuts and bruises. He fought to regain his breath, drawing in great gulps of air. His back hurt, and his legs. One arm seemed almost useless. "Oh, no, not broken," he wailed inwardly. Tentatively he tried to move it and found to his joy that it was only badly jammed. He remembered now. He'd landed on that hand. He glanced around and saw that he had fallen over a great exposed rock edge, perhaps a foot high, half as wide, but 8 or 9 feet long. Despite the inconvenience of dozens of pieces of broken rock on the ground there, he swung his body around so he was lying along the length of the rock, hoping thus to hide a bit while he regained his breath and a measure of strength. "If I'm lucky, I can hide here until they leave," he panted, striving to calm his nerves and slow his breathing. He peered cautiously over the top of the rock, back toward the burning wood. Soon he saw another of the men emerge carefully from the edge of the wood, but a considerable distance away. He watched this fellow as he crept out into the meadow, looking from side to side in search for their quarry. So intent was Hanlon on watching this man that he did not see nor hear the approach of a third man, until the other jumped the stone, almost landing on Hanlon. The SS man could not entirely stifle an exclamation, and instantly the man swiveled and shone his light directly on Hanlon. Swiftly the corpsman snaked out his hand, caught the goon's foot and yanked. The man fell backward, and Hanlon, injuries forgotten, leaped up. But with a lithe, swift movement, his attacker was on his feet, swinging at Hanlon with the hand holding his lantern. It was, the SS man saw now, the fellow he had thought he knocked out with his club. The Terran's hands darted out and grabbed the man's other wrist, pushing it up and away. For in the gyrations of the lamp, he had seen that the fellow carried a flamer. Forth and back they wrestled. By dint of extra effort, Hanlon kept the gun muzzle pointed away from him, but he realized sickeningly that his antagonist was stronger and heavier than he. For an Australian, this goon was really a giant. Hanlon decided on a desperate chance. Instead of pushing against the man's strength, he suddenly lunged backward. The goon cursed as he strove to keep his own footing and pulled back as best he could. Hanlon's reflexes were faster than the mobster's, and he took full advantage of the change of leverage. He twisted half sideways and let go with his right hand. He swung with all his strength at the soft belly before him. The man grunted and tottered, for he had not quite regained full equilibrium. Again and again Hanlon struck. The man staggered, reeled backward. A quick snatch, and Hanlon had the flamer, and used it. Swiftly he looked to see if the man he had been watching had noticed the fight and the flash. Apparently he had, for he was coming on a run. Hanlon snapped a shot at him and missed. An answering lance of flame almost got him. Hanlon tried another, and got only a weak sizzle. The first gunman's flame gun was dead. Only flight was left. Hanlon dropped the useless weapon and started off across the field as fast as he could run. He had not fully recovered his breath, and every muscle in his body shrieked from that fall and his unusual exertions. He stumbled and staggered, but kept on running as fast as he could. Behind, he could hear the yells of the gunman who was on his trail, apparently calling to someone else. The beam of the lantern held Hanlon almost steadily. Still the corpsman ran. He had no idea what lay ahead, or whether he was running toward safety or into more danger. There was no other cover he could see in the almost dark, no trees, no bushes. Merely this meadow, almost flat, covered with a sort of blossomy grass, not more than 2 or 3 inches high. Nor even if he could find something would he be long concealed from the lantern and the man who carried it. Hanlon swerved and ran toward but behind the lantern carrier, hoping thus to elude him, In fact, he had passed behind the fellow before the light rays picked him out again. The beam held him steadily again, and Hanlon could hear those pounding feet coming nearer. A gun flamed out again, and Hanlon felt the excruciating pain of a burn on the side of his arm. Yipe! That was close. He gritted, and he clamped his other hand over the wound, and tried to increase his speed. Weariness seemed forgotten for the moment, and he was able to spurt ahead. Suddenly, he saw twin beams of stronger light coming across the field to intercept him. "Oh, no!" he gasped. "The trike!" He swerved sharply to the right again and ran on. Ahead he heard a strange sort of roar, and only after a moment or so could he identify it. It sounded like the boom of breakers. "Am I that near the sea?" Again a sort of flame almost caught him. The car was roaring toward him, closer each second. He knew starkly that death or capture was only a matter of moments away. His mind had been reaching out, searching for any sort of animal life that might come to his assistance. But in this hour of need, even that avenue of help seemed to have detoured. That roar sounded closer, yet curiously distant. Yet he was almost sure it was the sound of breaking water. If it's close enough, maybe I can find safety there. It's my only hope now, he prayed. He pounded on, and suddenly, almost straight ahead, the nearer of Estrella's two moons swung above the horizon. Both moons were far closer to Estrella than Luna was to Terra. Neither was nearly as large, but they gave considerable light, and this nearer moon was almost at the full tonight. Hanlon could see better now, but he knew his pursuers could too, and that he was now plain in their sight. "Sorry, Dad, but looks like I failed," he groaned. The sound of the water was closer now, and it had more the texture of breakers than of surf. He devoutly hoped so. Breakers would mean rocks, and rocks would be hard to avoid if he had to dive. But more important, they would mean greater chances for safety if this meadow ran directly into him, so he could find a hiding place. Now both gunmen behind were closer. They were firing steadily, and even in his anxiety to escape, Hanlon found time to sneer at their marksmanship. "Wish I had a gun or a blaster. I'd show them some real shooting." Almost blinded now with fatigue, and his run barely more than a stagger, he struggled on, and suddenly skidded to a halt just on the lip of a sharp drop-off. He peered downward, and his heart did flip-flops. This cliff was well over 150 feet high, and straight down to the water's edge. It was the slapping of the water against it that he had heard. Even in the moon's rays, he could see that it was too vertical, too smooth, for a swift downward climb. He looked wildly to the right and to the left, but could see no possible safety. The car with its gunman was closer now, and one of the flames from their guns almost hit him. There was only one possible escape. He ran back from the cliff's edge for several yards, straight toward the onrushing car. Then he turned and sprinted for that edge. He took off like a broad jumper, as far outward as he could, curving his body downward into a dive. "Oh, God, please," he prayed earnestly. "Deep water and no rocks." It seemed an interminable age that George Hanlon fell through the air on that incredible dive toward the water so far away. Not knowing what was below made the moments seem like dreadful eternities. His mind persisted in painting ghastly pictures. At long last Hanlon struck, and was instantly numbed from the force of the blow and chilled by the icy water. His bruises, burns, and cuts smarted painfully from the salt. He plummeted into the depths, deeper and deeper, until he thought his lungs would burst, despite the great gulp of air he had breathed in just before he hit. He just couldn't take it any longer. He would have to let go soon, and try to breathe. But from some hidden source, he drew on new reserves of will and of strength, and fought on. He felt his descent slowing, and clawed his way upward. His head finally burst through the surface, and he trod water while he gratefully gulped in the reviving air. All at once he heard a sharp ping, and water splashed in his face. One of those goons have a pellet gun. Hanlon struck out away from the shore, swimming under the water as fast and as far as his breath and strength would allow, coming up only to gulp another lungful of air, then submerging again. Finally he surfaced and looked back toward the cliff top. He could dimly see 3 forms standing there. Another pellet struck close by, and another. Why, he wondered, hadn't they used that gun on him before? Never too strong a swimmer, the exhaustion and weakness of his wounds, and that long run made swimming almost impossible for the young Secret Serviceman. But he knew his life and the success of his mission here depended on his keeping going. He kicked off the heavy waterlogged special shoes that made his feet look Australian. Ridding himself of their weight helped a little. He had felt hundreds of tiny waves of strange thought beating at the fringes of his mind. And now he opened it wide to receive these impressions. "Fish," he said disgustedly after a moment, and he kept swimming further out. What good? He stopped and thought carefully. If it was a big enough fish, maybe. He sent his mind purposefully out and around. He was still trying to swim, but his body was worn out. He knew desperation, for even if he did outdistance their pellets, there was just not enough strength left in him to swim back to shore. He turned over on his back and floated, resting as much as possible, but still kept his mind searching through the waters. It was his only chance, he felt sure, and sent it even further out. Finally, he contacted a larger, stronger thought. Avidly he seized it, insinuated his mind into it, and realized at once that it was the brain of a fish. He forced it to swim at its top speed toward him. From the size and texture of the mind, it felt like a large fish. He hoped it was big enough. Soon it came up to him, and he saw that it was shark-like, almost 8 feet long, but rounder, and with a head and face much like that of a Terran sea elephant. Eagerly and thankfully, he grasped one of the small fins protruding from its underside, and his mind started it swimming along parallel to the coast. The musket-type gun had been splatting at him from time to time, evidently as fast as the shooter could reload. He looked up toward the cliff top and could see men running along it. Must be that they can see me, although he doubted if they could see the fish that swam just below the surface. Probably, he grinned mirthlessly. They're wondering how I can swim so fast. Another pellet plowed into the water close ahead of his face. The portion of his mind inside the fish felt the intolerable burning shock of pain. The fish seemed almost to stumble. It twisted and coiled about until Hanlon was able to tighten his control and calm it. In the dim moonlight, he could see the water becoming discolored, and knew the fish was bleeding profusely. His mind and the fish knew where the wound was, and Hanlon reached up for that place and found a gaping hole. He put the tip of his finger into it to stop the bleeding as much as possible, but he realized at once that this would not save his carrier, which by now he knew was not a true fish, but an amphibious mammal, just as Terran's whales are mammals, not fish. What could he do? As weak as he was, and as poor a swimmer as he was at best, there was absolutely no chance of his making it back to shore under his own power. And even if he did get back, there was no beach, only that unscalable rocky escarpment, and the gunmen on top of that. The fish was his only hope, for he had not been able to locate another fish mind of the same caliber, and now his savior was dying. More carefully now, with his mind inside the amphibian, he examined the structure of its brain and nervous and muscular systems. Would it be possible to close that terrible wound? He traced the nerves to the muscles of that portion of the body and skin. He tested and tried everything he could to figure it out. Finally, Hanlon found the muscle-nerve combination that controlled exactly that portion of the body. He made it contract and felt the muscle tighten around his fingertip. Gently he withdrew the latter from the wound and made the muscles close it tightly and completely. It was necessary to keep doing it consciously, for the moment he relaxed his concentration, it opened up again. He noted subconsciously that there had been no more shots for some time. Maybe the guy's out of bullets, he thought, or perhaps they think I'm dead, can see the blood stains and think they're mine. Or maybe, as an afterthought, they've lost track of me in the dimness and the choppy waters. Whatever the reason, Hanlon knew a deep thankfulness. He relaxed as best he could, shivering in the icy waters, still holding loosely onto the fin of the fish thing. He did not try to make it swim. In fact, he kept it from doing so. He would take time out to try to regain some of his own strength, while letting the fish overcome, if possible, some of its own weakness and shock from the pellet wound. Adwal Irad had been growing strangely worried. Acting on a compulsion he did not realize existed, he moved Admiral Newton to a different and a certain being in a spaceship high above hoped a more concealed place of imprisonment. Well, I'm getting ready to start a new chapter, so I think I'll just go ahead and take a break here, put on some music, and I'll see you in just a few minutes. Alrighty, I am back, and we are starting with Chapter 13. If I wait here a while, perhaps the fish's strength will build up again, George Hanlon had thought wearily. Then it can carry me back to shore. So he continued concentrating on the job of keeping those muscles closed around the wound in the amphibian's side, finding it required full use of his mind to think of holding that constriction and of nothing else. Only partially was that possible, of course. Humans are just not constituted so they can think of only one thing for long periods of time. At least, he grimaced, not this human. For nearly an hour, he and the fish lay there quietly, riding out the waves, while he waited for the great mammal thing to regain some of its energy. He kept close watch of that mind, and knew it was gradually feeling less pain, less anguish. He had sent it calming thoughts as best he could, and they had taken effect. The panic was gone. It was almost asleep, floating there. Hanlon looked toward the cliff top, but there were no longer any figures that he could see. Had the pursuers, thinking him dead, left? He strained his ears for the sound of the trike motor. Maybe, though, they've already gone before I thought to start listening, he thought. Finally, he decided the fish was strong enough to take him to shore. His own body felt so much more comfortable. Then he realized with a twinge of panic that the reason was that while he had thrown his mind into the healing of the fish, his body had become numb with cold. Now he again became conscious of his various cuts and bruises, aching and flaming from the action of the salt. Under his compulsion, the fish swam slowly and with some difficulty back toward the shore. When it finally got close to the wall of rock, Hanlon let his feet downward, hoping to be able to touch bottom, but the water was far too deep there. "I hate to do this to you, fella, but you're my only hope for the time being," Hanlon said, feeling to the great fish thing, and made it start swimming along the rocky wall. He kept his eyes constantly looking ahead for the break in the escarpment, or for a bit of beach where he could rest. After a mile or so, it seemed the cliff was getting lower, and Hanlon's hopes rose a bit. Another couple of 1,000 yards, and he was sure of it. It was sloping downward quite sharply toward sea level. Also, it seemed, in the moonlight, that the rocky surface was getting rougher, more climbable. Finally, they came to a place where the cliff was only about 20 yards ahead, nor did it seem to get lower on ahead. Too, it looked scalable. Hanlon stopped the fish and examined that facing carefully. Yes, he decided at last, there were enough protuberances and cracks so that it could be climbed, if he had the strength. Well, gotta try sometime, and my poor fish is about all done. He made it swim right up until he could reach out and get a firm grip in a large crack. "Goodbye, fella. Thanks for saving my life. Hope you make it out all right," he told the great mammalian shark thing. He released its hold on its fin, and his control from its mind. It turned and swam away, still feebly. Hanlon focused his attention on the task before him. Slowly and painfully he climbed, hunted for handhold and footrest. He had known he was tired, but had not realized how weak he was. It seemed he could never make even the short climb. His fingers, hands, and arms were numb with cold, his feet and legs unresponsive leaden weights. But from the deeps of his subconscious and will, and his urge to survive, he brought renewed strength and scrambled upward. At last, utterly spent, he pulled himself over the edge and lay gasping and shivering on the top of the cliff. He was almost ready to blank out when a thought struck him, and he struggled to retain consciousness. He could not just lie here and sleep. Probably those goons would still be looking for him. He must get away, somehow, somewhere. Again he set his mind outward, and felt whispers of thought quite a little distance away across the meadow. He followed the strongest of these, and found a mind quite powerful and intelligent in an animalistic way. He followed that mind into the brain that housed it, and took control. He made the animal, whatever it was, start swiftly toward him. While it was coming, he examined the mind more closely, and suddenly realized he was inside the brain of an Australian cavale. These animals, which the Terrans thought of as horses because they could be ridden or trained to draw carriages, were about the size of a Terran cow pony. They were striped almost like a zebra, but the colors were brown and yellow rather than black and white. The animals were quite vicious in the wild state, and none too tractable, even when trained. As usual with Australian animals, they were tailless and had heavy, sharp hooves, nearly twice the size of those on earthly horses, and snouts much like a roach's. When the cavale came up to him, Hanlon saw it was a stallion, slightly larger than average, but its mind he already knew it was a wild one, not domesticated or broken to saddle or harness. Nevertheless, he could control it, and made it stand quietly while he climbed slowly and laboriously to his feet, and from there managed to wiggle onto its back. He knew he was due to a faint in a few seconds, but kept his consciousness long enough to impress on the animal's mind that it was to take him back towards Tiara. He thought he knew the direction, and he thought he could keep awake the one part of his mind that was disassociated and in the cavale. However, because he might blank out completely, he instructed it to keep straight on the road to town. He leaned down and threw his arms tightly around the cavale's neck, then, with a sigh of thankfulness, let himself go. He had endured so much, and he was so tired, so tired. Yandor and his men had finally come to the conclusion that Gore Anlo was dead, out there in the ocean. They had been unable to see him for some time, yet they waited around for nearly half an hour, searching both the waters and along the cliff. Finally, he said they might as well go home, so they all piled in the large trike and started back to the city. But they had not quite reached home when Yandor found a disturbing thought persisting in his mind. He worried and puzzled over it for some time, and then issued sharp commands. Thus, when they arrived at his house, 2 of the men hurried into the backyard, and soon came back with 2 of the beasts Yandor kept caged there. "What's up, Chief?" one of the men asked as the tricycle sped back the way they'd just come. I don't really know," the impresario said slowly. I have a sort of feeling that maybe we can find Anlo after all. We better go back and look some more." For the watcher above knew Hanlon was not dead. All of George Hanlon's mind must have become unconscious, for the next thing he knew was when the cavale suddenly reared to escape those who were trying to stop it, and Hanlon's body was dumped unceremoniously to the ground. The cavale, released from its compulsion, took off across the meadow at top speed. Hanlon began to recover consciousness as rough hands slapped him awake. He first noticed that the sun was rising, for its rays were shining directly into his eyes. He blinked and turned his head away, and became aware of his captors. He saw Eno yonder standing there beside a large trike. Beside him was one of his henchmen holding the leashes of 2 straining tamus, the cat-like beasts, somewhere like Terran black panthers, save they were deep red in color, and had fangs much longer and sharper, and no tails. Hanlon knew to be trackers par excellent, as good as bloodhounds, nor were they usually as fierce and bloodthirsty as they seemed. The third man was the one who was holding him. "Well, now," Yandor eyed him angrily, "you think you're pretty clever, don't you?" Hanlon shrugged. "Doesn't look like it, does it?" "Who are you spying for?" "Who says I'm spying?" "Don't try to quibble with me, Gore Anlo. I want answers and correct answers, or I'll let my pretty pets here take over and see if you can elude them. And after I get through answering, you'll cinder me anyway." Hanlon sneered. "Whatever gave you the idea that I'd talk? If I had anything to say, that is." The mobster holding him cuffed him. "Don't talk to Eno yonder that way, you feedy." Hanlon turned his head and sneered into the man's face. "Watch who you're calling a snake." He twisted suddenly, drove his heel backwards into the man's shin, and pulled free. The fellow, even while yelping with pain, started to draw a flamer when Yandor commanded sharply, "Let him be! He can't outrun the Tamas." Hanlon spoke as though nothing had happened. "What gave you the idea I've been doing anything like you said?" he asked in a conversational tone. "What's this all about? What were you doing trying to look into or get into Adwal Irad's house? That the name of the guy who owns it? Just looking for anything worthwhile I could pick up. Since you got me fired just because I drank a little too much one night, I got to make a living somehow." "Well, now, I hope you don't expect me to believe that. I know who you are, and my patience is at an end. Do you tell me who you're looking for, or what you're after, or do I let the Tammuz loose?" "I've got nothing to," Hanlon began, but the man who had been holding him suddenly interrupted. "Look yonder at the man's ear." "Yes, and his feet," the other pointed downward. They all stared closely, and Hanlon wondered as he saw their eyes widened. Then, with a start, he remembered kicking off his oversized shoes, and now he noticed that the dye had come off his hands. He guessed with sickening certainty that the long immersion in the salt water had also loosened the plastic ears and nose, and that at least one of them had fallen off. "By Zappa!" Yander stepped closer. "One of his ears is very small." He reached out quickly and tugged at the other. Loosened as it was, it come off easily in his hand. "An alien!" Yander exclaimed. "And then your skin, it's not like ours." "His nose seems false, too," the third man said. Knowing his imposture was over, Hanlon himself pulled off the plastic overlay and disclosed his nose in its original size and shape. "Yes, I'm a Terran." "What are you going to do about it?" "Loose the Tammuz!" Yander snapped, and the man dropped the leashes he held. But Hanlon had read that command in the impresario's mind even before he uttered it, and had already taken over the minds of the two beasts. They were well equipped by nature to be deadly, even if that was not their true nature. The female whirled and jumped on the man who'd been holding them. The male made 2 quick leaps and was on the other gunman. Both men were borne backwards, and in seconds the great cat things had torn out their throats. "You should have remembered, I'm the world's greatest animal trainer," Hanlon said evenly. Yandor shrank back. Sure, he was next. "You fiend!" he cried. Then his inherent cowardice showed, and he threw himself on his knees. "Don't let them kill me," he pleaded in agonized tones. "I'll do anything. I'll give you everything I have. Only please, please keep those awful beasts away from me." Hanlon hated a cowardly bully. Also, much as he detested killing or maiming, he had learned not to let it get him down too much in his work when it was necessary. But with such an unprincipled killer and abject wretch as this one before him, he felt no such compunction. He looked contemptuously down at the thing groveling at his feet in a very paroxysm of fear. Disgusted, Hanlon turned away, climbed into the motor trike in which Yander and his men had come here, and started its engine. As he drove away, he impressed a command on those non-slavering beasts, who began bellying toward the helpless Yandor. But Hanlon could not repress a shudder of revulsion at what he felt forced to do. After a half-mile or so of driving, however, the weariness, the pain and chill struck him, and he nearly fainted again. He struggled to keep himself conscious so he could get back home, a matter of vital necessity now that he was not disguised. When he finally came to the more populated part of the city, in which people were beginning to be seen outside the houses and on the street, he had himself fairly well under control. He kept his head down and made himself as inconspicuous as possible, while driving at the highest allowable speed toward his rooming house. Then he jumped from the car almost before it stopped and ran in. He passed several of his neighbors in the hallway, but held his hank before his face and ignored their stares of surprise at his condition as he raced to his room. Once inside, he locked the door, then breathed a sigh of deep relief. He began stripping off his wet and bedraggled clothes, thankful, as he remembered the loss of his shoes, that he had an extra pair of those specially made ones. When he saw that much of his hair so meticulously glued onto his body was coming loose, he thankfully ripped the rest of it from him, then went in and turned on the shower, really only a stream of water from the end of a pipe. For nearly a quarter of an hour he stood under it, reveling in the first feeling of real cleanness he had known since leaving Simonides, relieved as the warm water washed the salt from his wounds and pores. Finally, having treated his burns and bruises, he put on a dressing gown to partially cover his nakedness, and sank into his comfortable chair. Then he let his mind review the happenings of the past night. Hanlon was once more in a cockily, jaunty mood. He had taken some terrific risks, and been in almost fatal jeopardy several times, had had adventures and escapes no one would believe if he tried to tell them, except some of the few SS men who knew about his special talents, and Dad, of course. Dad! He had almost forgotten his father's predicament in the excitement of the night. Now, as he considered and concentrated on this problem, Hanlon began to realize, dimly, sketchily, and much against his will, that things were not all right as he had felt for the moment. He tried to dodge that flickering thought, but it persisted, grew stronger, would not be denied. He finally was forced to consider it more thoroughly, and slowly it dawned upon him that he had not won, he had lost. He had smeared up the works, but good. His campaign was done, finished, kaput. He had put his foot in it, clear up to the sacroiliac. Worse than that, far worse. He had undoubtedly gummed up this whole Australian business. Not only was his own work undone, and now the natives would know that the Terrans were here, just as that propaganda machine had said. Now it would be practically impossible to make them believe that the Terrans were not responsible for the crime wave, and all the other things said about them. Me and my big swelled head, he castigated himself furiously. I ought to be horsewhipped. Almost he cried. His body was by turns ice-cold and feverish. He cringed mentally and physically. Was there any way, any possible way, he could redeem himself? Could he publicly admit that he and he alone was to blame? That he was here entirely on his own initiative, because he wanted to see Australia join the family of nations? No, that was absurd. It wouldn't be believed. No one in their right mind would ever conceive that a young man like him would do such a thing without some backing, undoubtedly full Federation backing. He would have to resign from the Secret Service, or, he gasped, were its members allowed to resign? Admiral Rogers had said it was for life, once he got in. But he didn't guarantee how long my life would last, Hanlon grimaced. Well, he drew himself up proudly. There was a way. He was not afraid to die. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's think this out. Death's no answer. For a new idea had just struck him. He forced the worry, the fear, the self-pity from his mind, and settled down to consider this new concept. Maybe it wasn't as bad as he thought after all. Yandor and his goons were the only ones who knew I was Terran, and they're dead, he thought. So they can't tell on me, and no one else knows it. Maybe I can go ahead just as I was. He rose to get dressed. There was still his father's imprisonment to be taken care of, if possible. Hanlon was sure now that it was in that little stone house back of Everett's mansion that the Admiral was being held prisoner. A casual glance in his glass, and he was suddenly conscious of his appearance. Hey, he couldn't go out like this in broad daylight, not looking like a Terran. Swiftly, he considered the possibilities. He would have to disguise himself again enough to escape notice on the street. But he was no cosmetician. even if he had the dyes, the plastics. He sank into his chair again and thought seriously. But even while he was trying to think and plan, his worn, tired body, exhausted as it had never been before, and depleted of all strength, could bear no more. Without even realizing it, he sank parsecs deep into profound slumber. Sometime during the day, without his knowing it, he must have gotten up and laid down on the bed, for it was right there he finally awoke. The room was dark. Only a small ray of light came in obliquely through the window from a distant street light. He got up, wincing at his lameness and stiffness. He went through some calisthenics to take the soreness from his body, then washed, dressed, prepared, and ate something. He hunted through his duffel bag and found a pair of gloves to cover his hands. Before putting them on, however, he wound a scarf around his head and face, covering most of it except his eyes. He pulled his hat well down, then put on the gloves. Leaving his room, he went inconspicuously along the darkest parts of the street until he came to the marketplace and a certain stall that specialized in theatrical costumes and makeup. It was the same place where he had bought that Roche mask. Walking purposefully, as though he had legitimate business there, he went to the rear of the shop. It was not too hard to break in and crawl inside. There, using his utmost care not to be discovered, he hunted about among the shelves until he found some facial putty, skin dyes, and other articles he needed. He left a couple of gold pentas on the counter in payment. Then, just as cautiously, he retraced his way to his rooms. Chapter 14. The next morning, when SSM George Hanlon awoke, his first thought was one of concern for his father. An impatient, driving urge for action seized him and made him jump out of bed. Then logic and clear thinking came to the fore, although it required conscious effort for him to prepare and eat his breakfast first of all. Hurriedly finished, though, he set to work on his new makeup, doing his level best to keep his thoughts on the difficult task at hand. He had let his whiskers and hair grow from the time he first received this assignment, of course, so was not too much concerned about the hairiness he must present to the world when dressed. Luckily, although it had often been a source of annoyance, he was one of those men whose beards grows clear down his face and neck to join, with hardly a break, the hair on his chest. As for the body hair that had been so painstakingly glued onto his body before, he decided not to attempt that. He had not yet had to disrobe in front of anyone here. He was certain he'd be able to avoid doing so in the future. He rubbed liquid rouge of a dark shade well into the skin of his face, neck, hands, and high up to his wrists, which took care of his coloring. His main worry was the nose and ears, especially the nose. That would be most quickly noticed if it looked artificial. His first few attempts were not only badly done, but almost ludicrous. His usually fine muscular coordination seemed to be lacking. But he persevered and finally, after several hours, managed to mold a fairly reasonable snout, and to so blend its edges into the skin of his face adjoining that it would, he felt, sure pass muster on casual inspection. He built up his ears in like manner, but to help with this deception, in case of any close scrutiny, he covered them with a head bandage. He put his hat on, pulled it well down in front and on the sides, and then examined himself critically in the mirror. "Boy, that's a sloppy job, and how!" he exclaimed, disgusted with his handiwork. Trevor would disown me if he could see it, but he finally decided it would have to do, he hoped. Now that he had finished, he discovered he was sweating like a nervous cavale. He held out his shaking hands and looked at them critically. What in John's name was wrong with him, anyway? And a thought he had, perhaps subconsciously, pushed far down into the furthest recesses of his mind, swept over him with full force. He did not want to think that thought. More, he did not want to have to make that decision. But Manning was dead. Hooper was fleeing insanely, perhaps also dead by now. His father was captive, imprisoned, tortured, if still alive. Only he, Hanlon, of the four, was left, and he was alone. Again in his mind came his father's earnest and incisive statement that getting Estrella to accept membership in the Federation was the most important thing that had come up in ages. It had to be accomplished, and quickly. Deep down, Hanlon knew what that meant. Individuals were expendable. The plan was not. He was beginning to learn that while plans may blow up in one's face, as now, such happenings must be accepted philosophically, without too much backward longing, without too great remorse, and certainly, which was the hardest to accept, without letting personal feelings or sympathy for those lost or in danger keep the one or ones remaining from going ahead with new attempts to bring the mission to a successful conclusion. For a long time Hanlon sat there, resolutely now. He put his father out of his mind and concentrated only on how he was to accomplish the task that confronted him alone. Finally, he began to look at the larger aspects of the problem, to realize that he must quit hunting for individual criminals and possible members of the opposition, and work from the other end, the top. After all, he thought, it is the ruler who makes the decisions. Perhaps, no, I must go to work on him. I've got enough dope now as to who is behind this intrigue. Now I must reach Elis Amir himself and swing him our way. But in Snyder's name, how am I going to get to him? Plan after possible plan he discarded. He could not go to Amir as a Terran. In the first place, his word would have no weight. In the second place, he would undoubtedly have considerable trouble making the approach to the ruler, if it was possible at all. No, he would have to get close to him as a native. And to do that, he first had to know more, a lot more, about the ruler as a man, his habits, and usual daily routine. Hanlon left the house and went to a number of places where men ate or drank, both for information and to try out his new disguise. The latter must have been better than he thought, for no one seemed to notice. And in each place he visited, while eating or sipping his mild drink, Hanlon asked one or two discreet questions. None of these, by themselves, seemed to mean anything, but the answers put together as Hanlon did when he returned to his rooms gave him a fairly detailed picture. He knew now that the ruler stuck quite closely to his residence palace. Hanlon thought of it. Although occasionally his duties took him to other cities on either continent, and sometimes he went out for an evening at the theater, as he had done on Hanlon's opening night. Otherwise he was a hard worker, an excellent and well-loved ruler, always studying carefully all suggested legislation that was presented for his consideration, always thinking of ways to better the condition of his people. But to one thing he had learned Hanlon gave the most consideration at the moment. Elis Amir, he found, went out almost every day for a ride on his cavall, and usually along the same route. Hanlon knew what road that was. Accustomed as he now was to thinking more in terms of animals than of men, the natural thought for Hanlon was to wonder how he could meet or study the ruler through his cavall. The next day, therefore, the SS man rode out into the country and posted himself at a convenient spot where he could watch without attracting too much attention. It could see for several miles. He took one of the wheels off his motor tricycle and demounted the tire. This was to be his excuse for being so handy at the time of his planned meeting with the ruler. But something apparently changed Elis Amir's habits, for he did not ride that road that day. Ruefully doing a bit of under-breath gripping, Hanlon replaced the tire and wheel, then rode back toward town. But after he had gone part way through the city streets, he thought of something else that must be done, and headed toward the place Morris Manning had found rooms. Luckily, no one else had moved in, and no one appeared in the hall when Hanlon came back. After a quick trip to a tool stall in the marketplace, where he was able to buy a hacksaw, for Manning, as did the other SS men, had attached a hasp and a pick-proof padlock to his door. The Australian's locks were ingenious, but could quite easily be unfastened, even without the key. The locks consisted of a metal rod like a sliding bolt that ran inside the wood of the door. There was a slip in the wood on either side of the door through which a key, inserted in the rod, could move it back or forth. When the bolt was moved into position with one end seated in the holder in the door jamb, a turn of the key opened the flanges of the rod that fitted vertically into prepared slots. But a little patience easily enabled one who wished to get in to trip those flanges with almost any small, flat-pointed instrument, even a penknife blade. Now Hanlon cut through the hasp, evidently without attracting anyone's attention, for none of the neighbors came out to investigate the strange sounds. Inside Manning's room he went about the sad business of collecting the dead Secret Serviceman's gear and belongings, to be sent back home on the sneak boat. As he was cleaning out one of the chests, however, Hanlon discovered a small notebook he knew was of Australian make. He opened it idly and found it filled with native writing. Excited now, for he was sure Manning would have written in Terran or ISC code if it had been his work, Hanlon slowly began deciphering the words. "Yeah, this is hot stuff," he exclaimed after less than a page. "Wonder where Maury got this. From Espor's office or home, I'll bet." He stuffed the book into his pocket for later study. He packed the balance of Manning's things, then left, mounted his trike, and rode back to his own rooms. All the balance of the afternoon and evening he worked at the translation of the entries in that book. It was, he found with great glee, a list of the names of various criminals who had been working under Espor, and brief details of their various activities, as well as many other notes of similar nature. One recent item caused a brief exclamation. "Ran Alden came seeking a safe hiding place today," he read. it having already been decided by Adwal Irad that the man's usefulness was over. He was cindered. "Dirty killers," Hanlon growled, his brief moment of joy at the direct mention of Irad dimmed by the import of that entry. "No conscience whatsoever." All in all, however, he was vastly pleased, and grew more so as he continued translating. For there were several mentions of Adwal Irad, and always pointing to him as the top man. Now he had real evidence of what he had believed, that this crime wave was directed by the second in line. Hanlon was vastly relieved. In the morning, as he was preparing to go out again to see if he could contact Amir, a thought sent him to the mirror, attempting some changes in his makeup. He worked subtly, and soon made himself look considerably older, about middle-aged. This, he felt, would make the ruler listen more carefully to his evidence than he might to a younger man. Then he rode out to that country road. Some time later he saw Elmas Amir riding that way. From Hanlon's vantage point, he saw the ruler and the single groom on their mounts, while they were still some distance away. Hanlon's mind reached out and touched that of the ruler's steed. There were a few moments of anxious trying, and then he was in full control of the animal's mind. Through its eyes, Hanlon looked out carefully along the road. It seemed fairly smooth, and he felt sure that if Amir was at all a good cavalman, as he must be after riding nearly every day, he would be able to stay in the saddle safely during the wild ride planned. Hanlon made the beast suddenly snort and shy to one side, then break into a wild gallop straight down the road, despite the ruler's frantic efforts at control. Swiftly the cabal pounded down the road, Amir working desperately to control it, yet seeming not to be too frightened by the runaway. The groom kicked up his own mount, but was hopelessly outdistanced. Meanwhile the cavale, controlled by Hanlon's mind within its own, paid no attention to the sawings and pullings on the rein and bit, and continued its apparently frightened bolt. As they neared the place where Hanlon was working on his machine, the young man straightened, looked, then jumped into the road. He started trotting toward them, waving his arms in an effort to make the cavale stop its mad rush. But although he let the animal slow somewhat, it kept running. As it drew closer, Hanlon moved a bit to one side, but still in the road. When the horse and rider were almost upon him, he turned his back to them and started running in the same direction, looking back across his shoulder. Just as the cavale came abreast, Hanlon suddenly leaped toward it and grasped the bridle. At the same time his mind calmed that of the beast and commanded it to slow and stop. To the ruler, Hanlon seemed to be dragged for several yards, still holding grimly to the reins he had grasped. When he finally brought the cavale to a stop, it stood with heaving flanks and blowing nostrils. "Whew!" Elis Amir wiped his face. "That was fine work, my man. Many thanks. I don't know what got into that stupid beast. He's never done that before." "Something must have frightened it," Hanlon said. He pretended he did not know who the rider was, having considered this point carefully. "You sure you can handle it now?" "Yes, I think there'll be no more trouble. By the way, is there anything I can do to show you my gratitude?" Hanlon looked surprised. "Why, I didn't do anything special. Couldn't let you get hurt. The ruler gazed at him peculiarly. Do you know who I am? No, should I? I am Elmas Amir. Oh! Hanlon made himself look properly surprised, then bent his knee in the Australian salute to the ruler. I beg your pardon, Knair, if I've spoken wrongly, for I did not know. Amir smiled. Well, now that you do, I ask again, is there anything I can do for you? You must want something. Hanlon shook his head. Thank you, sire, but I wouldn't dream of imposing on your generosity. I'm sure I can find a job somewhere. Oh, you're looking for work? Yes, Knair. I only recently came here from Lura. What can you do? Another shrug. Farm work, tending animals, that sort of thing. I love animals, especially cavals. I've hoped to get a job as a stableman on one of the estates here. The ruler looked at his groom, who had come galloping up, relieved to see that his master was unharmed, glancing curiously at this stranger who had saved the ruler, and with whom he could see Amir had been talking. Are there any vacancies in our stable force, Indar? The ruler asked. Why, no, Knair, not at present. Make one, then, snapped Amir. I want to give this man a good position. He is to take care of my personal string of cavals. As you order, sire. I don't like to make trouble for anyone, Knair, Hanlon protested. I don't want a job if it means putting someone else out of work. The ruler's eyes lighted up with a friendly smile. I assure you it won't. I like your attitude, my man. It is good to find someone who thinks of others before himself. Once more, Hanlon shrugged it deprecatingly. I've found in my lifetime, Knair, that it doesn't hurt me any to think of the other fellow. And the best part of it, I also found that when I do think unselfishly, I always receive far more happiness than otherwise. Ah, a philosopher. I must have many talks with you. Can you get to the residence all right? Yes, sire, as soon as I'm finished fixing my tire. Report to Endar here, then, when you get there. I'll instruct him as we ride back. Many thanks, Knair. I promise to serve you well and faithfully. The ruler nodded briefly and rode away, the groom following at a respectful distance. Hanlon hurriedly fixed the tire and wheel, then rode off toward the palace. Watching through the caval's eyes, he timed it so that he rode into the courtyard, just behind the ruler and the groom. Elis Amir was cordial as he dismounted. I see you got here all right. By the way, you never told me your name. I am called Ergo Lona, Knair. All right, Lona. Indar, see that this man has good quarters and whatever clothing he needs. Introduce him to the work. As you order, sire. The two men bent their knees, then led the cavals to the stables, as the ruler went up the steps into the residence. Hanlon noticed the groom was inclined to be a bit surly, and deduced the man was afraid of his job. He determined to make friends, if possible. It would hamper his work of spying if he had to watch for enemies close to him, like this man could be. Please tell me how I may help, Indar. He made his voice cordial, yet with a touch of servility. I'm proud that our ruler has given me work. I assure you, I want to do everything to make good here. I know you must be important here, to be allowed to ride with Knair Amir, and I hope you will teach me the regulations. I realize I can never be anything but a stable helper, but I do want to be a good one. I hope we can become good friends." The man unbent a little. "All right, I'll show you around." They stabled the cavals, and then the groom led Hanlon to a nearby building. It was of stone construction, 5-sided, surrounded by flower beds and trees. It was not only harmonious with the palace and other buildings and grounds, but a pretty little house by itself. "These are the living quarters for the grooms," Endar said as they mounted the steps. Inside, he pointed out the dining room, then led the way upstairs and down a short hall. "This will be your room." He opened a door, disclosing a small, but well-furnished, comfortable room. "I have a few things in Stiara," Hanlon said. "When will it be convenient for me to go get them?" "We have lunch in a few minutes. Then you might as well go," Endar said. "I'll give you a note to the official tailor and have him fit you with the proper clothes." Hanlon looked at him as though with new respect. "Oh, you must be the head groom then, Nair. I hadn't thought about that. Please pardon my presumption in suggesting that we be friends." Endar merely looked at him a moment, then turned and left without a word. Hanlon grinned to himself as the door closed. "It won't be too hard to keep ahead of that guy. Only I'll have to watch him all the time, or he could get nasty." Chapter 15. Hanlon was awakened shortly after dawn the next morning. "Darn, this having to pretend to such jobs," he growled to himself as he rose, washed and dressed. He had always preferred to sleep as late as possible, and getting up at such ungodly hours did not tend to make him too happy the first few hours of the day. Yet, young as he was, he had developed the philosophy of accepting what must be as gracefully as possible, and now consoled himself with the hope that he would probably not have to keep up with this imposture very many days. His first care was to examine minutely in the mirror the makeup he had applied. The ears and nose still seemed to be all right and holding tightly, but he was careful when no one was around during the days that followed to look at them as often as he could in a pocket mirror that he carried. After a good breakfast in the dining room, he was put to work cleaning, feeding, and watering the cabals. Endar brought 2 of the horses from their stalls, snapped their halters into rings in a post, and was busy currying them. When he finished, he saddled the 2 and led them out, after first telling Hanlon to make sure the stables were clean, in case the ruler came to inspect them. There were 3 other stablemen working at the same general tasks. Hanlon, without neglecting his own work, made it a point to try to engage them in conversation. "I love this kind of work, don't you?" he asked confidingly. "I'm so proud the ruler gave me this job." All the time he was studying their surface minds, trying to get a line on what manner of men they were, whether they would be inclined to be too friendly and intruding. But to his relief, he found they were rather stupid, loutish fellows, not caring too greatly about what they did nor who was working with them, as long as they had a good place to live, plenty to eat, and fair pay. They seemed mildly surprised at his evident enthusiasm. One of them answered in a churlish voice, "It's only a job, why get so excited about it?" His mind probings told him, however, that none of them was the type to be involved in any plot that might be going on, even as the most humble participants or workers. He had nothing to fear from them in any way. When the work was finished for the morning, the other 3 men went into the track room and began playing cards. They ignored Hanlon, not asking him to play with them, seemingly not caring what he did. He went outside, sought the shade of a large flower tree, and sat down with his back leaning against the bowl. He closed his eyes, the better to concentrate, and he strengthened his mental control of the cavals ridden by Elmas Amir and Indar, in which he had put a smallish portion of his own mind when they started out. He knew that so far no untoward incident had occurred. The ruler was riding along that country road, wrapped in thought, not talking, not meeting anyone, paying no attention to the groom following him. Hanlon had not expected anything would occur, but wanted to know if it did, and especially wanting to be sure he could perfectly control the ruler's cabal at all times, no matter what the distance. Early the next morning, a houseman approached the stables. Nair Amir says to get his son's cabal ready, for he rides with him today. Indar indicated a certain animal to Hanlon. Bring that one out and get it saddled. The young man's gear is the second set on the right of the door in that tack room. Hanlon hurriedly led the cabal out, snapped its halter ring in a nearby post, and then ran to get the blanket, saddle, and bridle. Those back legs aren't smooth, the head groom snapped. Hurry and brush them again. Everett is particular. Yes, Nair, thank you. Hanlon made haste to obey, and was careful in his work. When the beasts were ready, the groom took the reins in his hands and led them to the mounting block. Hanlon implanted parts of his mind in each of the 2 cabals. Thus he was ready for his spying when the 2 men came out of the residence. Hanlon implanted parts of his mind in each of the 2 cabals. Thus he was ready for his spying when the 2 men came out of the residence. Through the eyes, wide set in the only slightly elongated broad heads of the steeds, Hanlon studied this important new character, of whom he had heard much. He saw a tallish, very intelligent-looking native, guessed him to be in his mid to late 20s. The fellow had a slight, though wiry build, and reddish-blonde hair and trimmed beard. Hanlon liked this Enver on sight, and decided instantly that what he had heard was somehow wrong. The ruler's son certainly did not look half crazy. He pondered the matter. Was that impression being sowed about the planet deliberately? Was someone trying to tear down any reputation or influence the young man might have? This, his eyes gleamed, is going to be good. I'm sure going to watch and listen carefully today. Hanlon crowded into the brains of the 2 cabals all of his mind that he could, finding that the animals had enough capacity to take a full half of his own mind. He had barely enough left in his body to keep up with his work, luckily, which did not require much mental effort. He still had much more left than the other stablemen possessed. The riders had barely left the palace grounds when Hanlon, through the caval's ears, heard the young man speak. I hope, Father, that you have thought about the subject I broached to you the other day, and the reasons I suggested for your further study. I pray you have decided that our world will do well to join the Federation of Planets, as we have been invited to do. Hanlon could tell by the tone that the ruler's mind and voice was troubled. Son, I don't know what to decide. There are so many things to think about. There are many good reasons why we should, it's true. There are also many equally good reasons why we should not. I am, as you know, very jealous of Estrella's independence. I should hate to see it made subservient to any other power. Father, Enver said earnestly, we would not be. I have studied very carefully the proposition made us by the Federation Council, and the copy of their constitution they sent with it. They guarantee each planet complete autonomy, and state very plainly that the Council is only a judicial body set up to negotiate intra-planetary treaties, and to see that the various worlds remain in harmony with each other. The advantages. But it's all a trick of those Terrans to get control of the entire galaxy, his father broke in. That's not only nonsense, Father, but a deliberate lie. I'm sure you know who is fostering it, and I think you can guess the reason. I presume you're talking about the second in line, but Irad isn't like that at all. He is a good mind, and he has presented some excellent reasons and arguments as to why we should not join the Federation. Sure he would. He wants to keep Estrella free, so that when he takes over he can pluck it like a... That's a strong indictment, son. I hope it's not jealousy because he won out over you in the tests. It is not jealousy. And while I haven't the proof yet, Nair, I do know it's true, the young man said hotly. You can be sure that when I do get the truth, I shall call for Irad's impeachment. No, Father, I and many friends are concerned over this matter, and are satisfied we are correct. Hanlon could guess at the troubled eyes of the older man, and that he was shaking his head sadly. I hate to think of Adwal Irad, he said. He has always seemed so interested in helping me to build up Estrella's economy, and is constantly bringing better ideas for her betterment. He seems to be making every effort to become worthy of his post when he succeeds me. I know, sadly. He wasn't like this until recently, but he has changed some way, Father. Now he is power-mad. Also, he is trying to make me out a fool and a brainless Dara, Enver snapped. Why, I never heard him say anything like that. There was astonishment in the elder's voice. He always speaks well of you. Naturally, Nair. He wouldn't be crass enough to say anything of that sort to you, but he and his henchmen are spreading that story all over our world. Oh, I'm sure you're mistaken. I'm not, grimly. The evidence on that is unmistakable. There was decisiveness now in the ruler's voice. If that's true, I'll certainly put a stop to it. Don't, Father, not at once, his son pleaded quickly. Do not even mention it to Adwal yet, please, nor make a public pronouncement about it. That would put him on his guard, and I and my friends need time to prove the other things that I'm talking about. I'll not have a word spread that my son is a weakling or stupid. The elder's voice was angry, and Hanlon felt the jerk on the reins of his cavall that told of the sudden gesture. Just so you don't believe it, Father, is all I care at the moment. Hanlon felt the two animals swerve and touch sides, and knew that Amir had drawn closer to his son, and shrewdly guessed he was touching the boy lovingly. You need never fear that, Enver. I've always been proud of the way you've taken hold of things, ever since you were a boy. I've tried, Nair, to make myself a worthy son of a great father. There was emotion in the young man's voice. I've studied everything I thought would help me, economics, psychology, statecraft, history, and all, and especially, since the Federation first made contact with us, I've tried to learn all I could about them, their various forms of government, their history, and everything. That's why I'm so sure they mean us well and not harm. But we're not Terrans. We're just semi-civilized beasts in their eyes. Another of Adwal's dirty lies, Inver snapped. If they felt that, would they have asked us to join them as a full-fledged world? No. They would have come here with a fleet of warships of space and conquered us. They could have easily, you know. They make no effort to hide the fact that they had such power from the ones who were taken on that inspection trip. No, we have no spaceships and nothing that could stop one, his father admitted. That's one of the things that has made me hesitate to decide against them. The fact that they have them, but they did not use them. On the other hand, if we decide not to join, how do we know they won't send their fleet here and... Because they aren't that kind of people. Why, sire, in their history, I learned that when the Terrans first started exploring space, one of their great men, named John Snyder, who seems to have had quite a lot of power at the time, promulgated a ruling that says man must never colonize any planet having inhabitants intelligent enough to show cultural activity and growth. And that concept has never been broken, and is still in force. Why, I never heard that. I told you, Nair, I have been studying them diligently, and so know much about them. Well, I reckon I better stop reading right there, 'cause it is about top of the hour. So, I thank you all for listening, and hope you're still enjoying this book as much as I am. And I thank you for listening to Haggie Shack Radio, simulcast to Wolf Spirit Radio. I'll see y'all later. Bye now. Thanks for listening.